Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome back. Thank you for those who have stayed, and thank you for those of you who are new. Um, Again, I'm Michael Kugelman. I'm the Deputy Director for the Asia program at the Wilson Center and our Senior Associate for South Asia. So this morning we looked at our topic, broadly speaking, from a historical perspective, looking at constitution making and how that really applied to the state of religious freedom today. This afternoon in our discussion, we're going to focus a bit more emphatically on the contemporary. And so we're once again going to be looking at India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, and this time we're going to be bringing Sri Lanka into the mix as well. And once again, we're going to have four excellent speakers. I'll very briefly highlight who they are in the order that they're going to speak. First, we'll hear from Raza Rumi, who's a scholar in residence with the Department of Journalism and a faculty member at the Roy H. Park School of Communication at Ithaca College, where it really must have been cold in recent weeks. We will then hear from Dr. Cassie Adcock, who is an associate professor at Washington University in St. Louis. She's a historian of modern South Asia with a focus on religion and politics in modern India. Neil Devota is an associate professor at Wake Forest University, and his teaching interests include ethnicity and nationalism, government and politics in South Asia, and comparative foreign policy. And finally, we'll be hearing from Ali Riaz, who is a professor and chair of the Department of Politics and Government at Illinois State University. And his research interests include Bangladesh affairs and Islamist politics. And you've got their detailed bios in front of you, which will tell a lot more than I just told you about all of the impressive things that these folks have done. So I'm not going to waste any more time. I want to make sure that we get to the presentations and get through the presentations with enough time to have a very good discussion. So with all that, I'll now cede the floor to Raza.
Okay. Thank you, Mike, for the introductions. Just a little correction. I'm now at Cornell Institute for Public Affairs. I used to be at Ithaca College. So because, for representational purposes, I need to clarify that, lest I'm sued by someone. So I'll just pick up on some of the threads from the morning. Farnaz Isfahani, in her excellent paper and talk, outlined some of the historical developments within Pakistan on how the state adopted a religious identity and how that has impacted not just the situation with minorities, but also for the majority Muslim population and the various sects therein. So I am going to talk more specifically about the blasphemy laws that were alluded to by Farnaz in the morning. She mentioned how they kept on changing, and I am going to focus that because if you all remember in recent weeks, Pakistan's capital was under siege by thousands of protesters who were basically protesting against some little minor clerical change in the oath of office that is administered to the politicians, in which there was a doubt whether the finality of Prophet Muhammad was either under attack or had been amended. And that led to sparked these huge protests. It led to, the siege of the federal capital for more than 3 weeks. Kids could not go to school. People could not reach hospitals in time. And ultimately, the government ordered a crackdown, but the crackdown could not succeed because, as you see, the protesters beat up the policemen. In fact, one policeman died and many were injured. Public property was damaged, etc. And then we had an agreement brokered by the Pakistan's military, which sent these protesters home. And a major general signed this. This is an agreement in Urdu which says that, the law minister who made that mistake of changing the oath of office will resign. And so it was also cited as yet another surrender by the Pakistani elites, in front of forces of extremism and bigotry. And Farnaz mentioned this term of, acceding to these demands by the hardliners, which has been a theme in Pakistan's history. And then we saw this iconic image of a senior official distributing checks and cash for some of the protesters so that they could safely go back home. And that also kind of worried a lot of people within Pakistan and outside, that as to why these sort of people who were attacking public property and killing policemen were being given a safe passage. And this is actually the kind of a history, a theme in our history that I want to focus in my talk this afternoon. And basically, as we discussed in the morning, that Pakistan's issue right at the start of or at the creation of the country remained, what was Pakistan? Was it an Islamic state, or was it a nation state for the Muslims of India, or was it a hybrid theocracy or a full theocracy? And that question is unresolved. I mean, it's an open debate still. So we have, secular progressives like Farnaz Isfahani, who say Jinnah promised on, and I believe that as well, on 11th August, he wanted to make Pakistan a secular, tolerant state. And then you have the other side which says, no, Jinnah invoked Islam too many times, and he wanted Pakistan to be an Islamic state ruled by Sharia laws. And that contest it remains very much in force, but that was actually very conveniently exploited and used as a political instrument by Pakistan's elites, particularly the civil military bureaucrats. So in the first decade of Pakistan's existence, it was the British-trained bureaucrats who ruled the roast, who made all the policy, and they set the direction of the country, and they thought that using this Islamic card would be a great means to maximize their power within the post-colonial arrangements. And Jinnah's speech of 11th August that was referred to earlier in the morning, interestingly, one of the top bureaucrats of the country ordered the newspapers to censor it. So while the founder of the country, so imagine if Abraham Lincoln or, I don't know, Jefferson had made a speech and some bureaucrat in White House told the papers, don't print it because it kind of undermines the two-nation theory construct. And so, that by itself speaks of the intense conflict that was there. And to get Pakistan, come into being, Jinnah had to pander to all sorts of modern Muslims, secular Muslims, hardline Muslims, the Barelvi sect, etc., the Sufi peers. And so everybody imagined Pakistan to be something along their sectarian imagination. And that is the kind of problem that we still have to grapple with. But throughout Pakistan's history, and some of these are highlighted, some of these markers or kind of watershed moments highlight the gradual evolution of Pakistan into a hybrid theocratic state. So starting from 1949, it is not a theocracy by any means, but like Iran or Saudi Arabia, etc., but it has incorporated those elements within the body politic and within the constitutional and legal framework. So in 1949, we had the first kind of a surrender where the mullah said, we want an Islamic state, and the country's founder said, okay, have it. Then in 1953, there were these riots against Ahmadi community, whom Farnaz explained their provenance and the problem. Basically, they're a minority sect, and the majority sect has issues with their belief system. But the state jumped in and declared them as non-Muslims in 1974. But prior to that, there was this whole anti-Ahmadi riots which erupted, and that kind of led to this polarization within the Muslim imagined identities of Pakistanis. Then in 1974, the Ahmadis were finally declared as non-Muslims. It's the first in the history of parliaments that the parliament actually chose to accord a religious or sanction a religious identity to people. I mean, there are very few precedents in history that we can find. In 1977, the elected Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who was a secularist and a Democrat, so his government faced a huge movement. it's called the PNA movement or the Pakistan National Alliance, but it wanted Nizam-e Mustafa or the Sharia or the system of the Prophet, with whichever way you interpret it, and that led to Bhutto's downfall, arrival of a coup, and that particular moment of Pakistan's contemporary history, the decade of 1980s, the General Zia's dictatorship, which completely altered not just the legal structures, but even the societal contract that the state had with different communities within the country. And of course, Zia was aided and abetted later, 2 years later, by the international community, including the US. The US cannot really absolve itself of its role because in 1979, two moments arrived. One was the Iranian revolution, and the other was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So Pakistan, suddenly became this frontline state, one for the US to contain the communist march into Afghanistan, and further on, and second, it became a frontline state for the Saudi Wahhabi Sunni extremism, because the Khomeini's first declaration was that that the revolution was not limited to Iran, that they would export it. Very much like the Lenin versus Trotsky debate was going on in Iran as well. And that obviously alarmed the Saudi monarchy and the Wahhabi order. And they said, hey, Pakistan, come and help us out. And General Zia said, yes, of course, give us more money, billions, etc., and we'll do all that you deliver. And so whatever was happening was in a geopolitical context as well. I mean, there were domestic variables, there was a domestic impetus, but we cannot separate or divorce these two realities. And then, of course, Zia's introduction and change in blasphemy laws in the 1980s, leading to the 1990s final amendment, was also a kind of development that has led to the current blasphemy crises in Pakistan, the way you all read about, lynchings or non-Muslims being booked under, and even Muslims. Half of Pakistan's blasphemy law accused are actually Muslims, just to clarify, in fact, more than half. But of course, the very tiny minority bears a disproportionate brunt of these laws is a given. And there are, the data is very difficult to obtain, but, hundreds of blasphemy cases have been filed. More than 40 people as we speak are on death row, and at least 75 people have been killed on mere allegations or, public mob incitement of religious passion. And that's something that continues. So going back to history, in 1953, the anti-Ahmadi riots in Lahore, they were, it's a very peculiar moment, because again, we had a Bengali prime minister in Pakistan. Bengalis were the majority in Pakistan of Pakistanis who left us in 1971. As Farhanaz said, they were liberated or we lost them, whatever. It's a historic open debate, but of course it was a very sad and tragic, mournful second partition in the subcontinent. And this image was there that, that was, so the incitement of these passions against the Ahmadis were being used by the then Governor General, who was a bureaucrat, to basically effect a regime change. So right after these riots ended, it resulted in the first martial law in Pakistan. The Prime Minister, Bengali Prime Minister Nazimuddin, was fired. So these riots ended in March. The martial law was imposed for a month, and Nazimuddin was fired. And later on, the rest is history. Then in 1977, again, the use of religion. This time it was the, in 50s it were the bureaucrats. In the late 70s, it were the generals who have had enough of Bhutto. They made him. They first sort of helped him become a huge leader, assume foreign policy power, being a position of influencing, from wars to domestic sort of arrangements. And then by the 70s, he had grown too big for his boots, so he had to be cut out. All the religious parties, this is where the on the right side are all the religious figures of all sectarian variants, and on the left are Bhutto's cabinet members. And here are people again being, very not too different from what happened a few weeks ago. People being bait charged and the police being attacked, and there were deaths resulting in the coup. And in 2017, I've already shown you these images. So there's a historical pattern going on. It is about both about political instrumentalization of religion, and particularly the idea of blasphemy, because it's something that you can rally public support around. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is a kind of a sort of rallying figure, a commonly cherished and loved figure for all Muslims. And the easiest thing to incite political passion is to say, well, someone has actually said something bad about the Prophet, and you have these riots, etc. But the origins of blasphemy law again are rooted in the colonial state. So in the 1920s and in 1930s, the British state kept on strengthening the blasphemy law. Their aim was to maintain public peace between the different communities, because they had done so much of divide and rule for 70, 80 years that now they realized that the perils of it were a threat to their own order. And what we did in the decade of 80s and 90s was actually to take, what the Pakistani, let's say, elites did, was to pick up exactly that agenda and strengthen some of these colonial continuities to both, drum up Pakistani nationalism around anti-Ahmadi movement, around the issue of blasphemy, and about the imagination of Pakistan as this fortress of Islam. So this was an official term under Ziaul Haq's era, used time and again, that Pakistan was a fortress of Islam. And that it appears in our textbooks, it appears in our public narratives, it appears in our media debates, in our political party manifestos. So it's very pervasive, since then. And but again, it has, the idea of blasphemy in the colonial era also had a historical kind of root. And one figure was Ghazi Ilmuddin, or Ilmuddin. Ghazi, we call him Ghazi, is a kind of a mujahid. And Ilmuddin in 1920s actually killed a Hindu publisher in Lahore, who published a defamatory book against Prophet Muhammad. And Ilmuddin, this is his tomb in Lahore, which, as you can see, is still a site of worship and reverence. And this is his, so he was locked up, he was finally convicted and hanged by the British government in in colonial India. And this is his jail cell where he lived, and there's a huge, you can see a plaque which says that, he's a lover of Prophet, and he's a shaheed, he's a martyr, and this is what happened to him. And, you have these books on him, popular literature, you have several cinematic productions, there was even a TV play, there are public roads named after him, even a state hostel in Islamabad is called Ghazi Ilmuddin Shaheed Hostel, right in the federal capital. And so, it was an old theme, playing up the religious polarization and using it for political advantage was very much what the post-colonial state was also doing in a more sort of insidious and inventive way, perhaps. And so these were in 1980s we added to what the British left us, and we were pretty self-sufficient in this department. So you can see that there were clauses added that you could not say, if you defile the Holy Quran. So now many cases are filed if somebody discovers a page of Holy Quran, holy book in someone's, they go and plant it in the garbage trash can, and then they say, hey, the book has been trampled upon, and book him or her under blasphemy. Then you have blasphemy against the prophet, against holy personages as well. So the companions of prophet, the Islamic divide for 1400 years has been that three companions of the prophet are on the Sunni side, are revered by the hardline Sunnis, I should say that, because we revere all of them. And the fourth caliph is revered by the hardline other side. And so they were also, so there was a whole sectarian agenda. And again, I would like to contextualize it that this is happening post-Iranian revolution. This is happening when Pakistan has entered into a defense pact with Saudi Arabia to safeguard Saudi interests, etc. And Saudi interests is also the export and promotion of Wahhabi Islam, which continues unabated and, and again, very much under the US watch and with US active support. And then we added stuff like, about holy personages and holy places. And then finally, the Ahmadis or the Qadianis, who are called, those clauses were also added within the legal framework. I'll skip these constitutional provisions and I'll come to the 1986. So you can see the text of what was added in 1986 to the blasphemy laws. So use of derogatory remarks in respect of Holy Prophet, whoever by words, either spoken or written, or by visible representation, or by any imputation, innuendo, or insinuation, directly or indirectly defiles the sacred name of Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, shall be punished with death. They are imprisonment for life and shall also be liable to fine. So now a lot of people are being booked for Facebook posts, for WhatsApp messages or, casual remarks. So the law is so open to, it's so vague. I mean, what is an innuendo? How do you define an innuendo or an insinuation? So there's a definitional issue. And then, of course, there's an embedded doctrine of vagueness in this text within the laws, that you keep them open so that you can use and abuse them. And then, of course, with the introduction of capital punishment, it was not there in the British original law. That was maximum 2 years imprisonment. With that, they have become even more draconian. So, but blasphemy law is not just about religious vendettas or about sectarian differences. As I will quickly run you through that, it is also made worse by the colossal failures of Pakistan's legal and judicial system, which lead to both, a miscarriage of justice and also, for example, this is a recent report by the ICJ, and in which they looked at 100 cases in the last decade or so, and they came up with these common trends in terms of how the judges and lawyers were biased in their judgments, in the proceedings, how, even the blasphemy accused could not hire, did not have a right to defense. And many lawyers have actually been killed or attacked or threatened to take up blasphemy cases. And there is general lack of due diligence in prosecution and investigation, and the police can come and arrest you without a warrant if there's a blasphemy charge against you. And so 100 judgments analyzed by the ICJ from 86 to 2015 found out that 19 out of 25 cases are under Section 295C. Many acquittals had taken place for glaring procedural irregularities and mala fide complaints. So even the courts are noticing that how open and wide the abuse is. And then the real problem is that the ones booked under blasphemy are kept in solitary confinement, often because the other inmates might attack them for being blasphemers, and so they languish in solitary confinement for years. And right of bail is often denied to them as well, because this is a capital punishment offense. So I'll quickly run through these. So, one of the economic rivalry and property dispute has also attracted the invocation and use of blasphemy laws. So if I have a property dispute, the easiest thing to get my opponent or the person I'm fighting with out of the way is to book them under blasphemy law. They'll be in for years, and the family would be struggling to get them out. Then you have political rivalries, local political feuds also turn blasphemous. Then you have marital disputes. A lot of cases go where spouses are filing against each other. I mean, I should not laugh, but I mean, it is pretty laughable. So where they think that, the best way to get rid of the spouse without the nuisance of a divorce is to lock them in under blasphemy law. Then you have, of course, the religious and sectarian differences. And then, past criminal and civil litigation, if that's not going anywhere, if the evidences are not coming forward, or the case is not going in your favor, you will bring in a little twist in the saga, and you'll say, well, my opponent in this case, I saw him or her defiling the pages of Holy Quran last night as I was passing by his house, and let's book him under that. And the police is bound to arrest, and the case can actually go on for a decade or so. And in 43% of cases, in another study found, again, an analysis of dozens of these cases found that nearly 43%, even by the account of malfunctioning Pakistani courts, 43% of cases were general abuse of this law. In last year, we've also seen, and earlier in the recent years, that blasphemy law has also become a very convenient instrument to suppress dissent. So whenever you have an issue, so for example, Pakistan's largest media house, Jio and Jung Group, in 2014, they were booked under blasphemy laws after they had dared to question Pakistan's security apparatus for attacking a journalist in their fold. And guess what? Within a week, there was a blasphemy case, and the entire management had to run away outside the country to save their lives. Last year in 2017, many social media activists and bloggers were picked up who were posting on Facebook, and a whole media campaign was drummed up saying that they were actually actual blasphemers and they are under an investigation, while they were being critical of the military. So there's a clear sort of open for all misuse and abuse going on, which is so. One of the other cases was Mashal Khan, who was murdered in April 17 last year, a 26-year-old journalism student, and whose Facebook posts were rumored to be blasphemous, and students and staff and outsiders came and lynched him on a university campus. Here's Junaid Hafiz, another young scholar, Fulbright scholar actually, teaching in a southern Punjab university. And he was once again, by his own colleagues on the university campus, they accused him of blasphemy, and he's in solitary confinement for years. And his lawyer was actually shot dead in 2014 for arguing his case. And so it goes on and on. So there are some obvious. Farhanaz mentioned in the morning that Musharraf, the enlightened, moderate dictator, tried to do something, but very soon he realized that the mullahs would not let him do it, or mullahs or his own colleagues within the large security apparatus were not keen to get that reform going on. At least he was putting in a filter that before the blasphemy case was filed, the police would do due diligence and investigate, and then the case would be right. It was a very minor change. But there have been amendments tabled. There have been cases, bills presented, but they haven't come to any pass because, even talking about reform of blasphemy law is considered to be blasphemy. So here my paper will have more detail on the way forward on how to fix some of these issues. But one of the greatest cases where a public official, the governor of Punjab province in 2011, took the case of a Christian woman, and he was killed by his own guard, a serving elite police guard who thought that since he was advocating the cause of a Christian woman and calling for reform of blasphemy law, he was a blasphemer. And his murderer, the policeman, He was celebrated as a hero. You can see he was showered with rose petals when he was brought to the court. I shouldn't say thankfully because I'm against capital punishment, but thankfully justice was done, and he was in the last government, executed under the Supreme Court order. But the problem is that this narrative, which is rooted in both the construction of Pakistani identity, the kind of colonial continuities, and the convenient ploy used by Pakistan's elites, this is his son now being groomed as the, martyr's successor. So this is his tomb, governor's murderer, which has been made, this is the inside. So his urs, which is like the death anniversary celebrated as a big event, and there are property deals also under his name. So if you want to get a plot in front of his tomb for 300 yards, you can actually contact this number because it's a holy site. So it's as crazy as it can get when it comes to inciting of these passions. So I'll just end now with these some of the other images that I wanted to. Actually, I want to show a 1-minute video, Mike. Is that possible? Yeah. Okay. And so I'll just quickly switch to that. So I hope we get. How do we change? While he's just putting the video, so basically it's what we have. Earlier when this conference was held, and I was going to write about a different theme. Because the previous Prime Minister of Pakistan, Nawaz Sharif, who was considered as a conservative center-right politician, actually during his tenure, which ended abruptly in July, he had surprised a lot of people in Pakistan, and he had undertaken a series of reforms, which included recognizing Hindu marriages, a Christian Divorce Act. He had been very vocal in presenting himself as the kind of an emerging liberal politician, and there were very hopeful signs. So part of it has to do with democratic continuity in Pakistan as well. And so my original paper was going to be around that. So can you make it full screen? Okay. But unfortunately, the events. So here's a small video that we had prepared for Mashal Khan, the young student. It's a minute and a few seconds. So. Thank you. So I think I'll end at that.
Well, thank you, Raza. Very sobering material. Much appreciation. Well, next we're going to hear from Professor Cassie Adcock. And if you don't mind, Latif, just bringing up her PowerPoint presentation. We shift from Pakistan to India.
Yeah, you can pass that down. Oh, it's closed out again. Is it just loading up? It's okay. So first, I really want to thank Niti Nair for organizing this, and also Michael Kugelman for your role in this event. It's so nice to have this kind of comparative discussion. I'd also like to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities and Fulbright and the Kluge Center for having funded my research in the past on this topic. I'm not only a scholar of South Asia and a student of cow protection, I've also been thinking about religious freedom. So I've taken a slightly different tack on this paper than some of my colleagues. I've used this occasion to review and assess the reports issued since 2015 by the U.S. Department of State's Office of International Religious Freedom and by the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. I think we have some representatives here in the room, which I'm pleased to see. Those reports incorporate statements about cow protection in India. Both offices were established to advise the government on policy, so they seemed a reasonable place to start. I aim to complement the information summarized in those reports and also to sound a certain note of caution. So I'll begin with a brief summary. Oh, and my image was actually just of some, this is actually unfortunately, USURF has more pretty reports than IRF, so I don't mean anything by that, but these are just some examples of the kind of materials I've been looking at. I'll begin with a brief summary. Recent years have seen a spike in violent attacks on minorities in India in the name of protecting male and female cattle from slaughter. The violence, perpetrated by members of the Hindu majority community who style themselves cow vigilantes, has followed in the wake of legislation passed in many states since 2015 to tighten restrictions and prohibitions on cattle slaughter and the sale or possession of beef. Laws restricting the slaughter of cattle have been on the books in many Indian states almost since independence, but the strengthened laws and the vigilante violence that accompanies them are clearly connected to the ruling Hindu Nationalist Party, the BJP or Bharatiya Janata Party, which has been in power since May 2014. Hindu nationalists, who are outspoken champions of cow protection, have a record of hateful, religiously divisive speech and violence toward minorities. Some examples that are just cited in the US reports, those religious freedom reports, are sufficient illustration. So, quote, they earn here, eat here, proliferate here, and then praise Pakistan. The members of this community should be sent to Pakistan. These are government officials. Muslims can stay in India, but they will have to give up eating beef. Right? Muslims could continue to live in this country, but they would have to give up eating beef as the cow is an article of faith here. Right? So Hindu nationalists, in addition, they regularly advocate a majoritarian vision of India for Hindus and portray religious minorities as anti-national, un-Indian, and disrespectful of the Hindu majority. Many BJP officials in government have also openly endorsed vigilante violence in the name of the cow in various ways. Together with cow protection, the influence of Hindu nationalism in society and in government has contributed to India's continued ranking by USURF as on a religious freedom watch list. The US religious freedom reports rightly include legislation against cow slaughter in India. Right? This legislation is widely regarded in India and outside as an unjust imposition on all Indian citizens of a Hindu religious scruple against killing the sacred cow. The professed aim of religious freedom in international policy is to diminish religious discrimination and interreligious violence, and the US religious freedom reports treat the freedom and equality of religious minorities with special concern. The US religious freedom reports stress cow protection's negative impact on the Muslim religious minority in India. It is clear that cow protection poses a serious threat for secular democracy and for Indian citizens' most basic rights to life and livelihood. In assessing the US religious freedom reports, I have a few things that I'm going to say about their accuracy, but my main purpose is to assess the adequacy of the account of cow protection that they provide. That is, and I believe I have a, that's something else, never mind. But my main purpose is to assess the adequacy of the account of cow protection that they provide. That is policy based on their account likely to strengthen or diminish sectarian identities and anti-minority discrimination in India? I've suggested that I see some problems, so allow me to pause to say a little bit about why. So scholars have been making a coordinated effort to describe the political consequences on the ground of national and international policy directed to securing religious freedom. I could cite a number of publications here. I've also published on this issue. I think a good place to begin, especially for those concerned with policy, is this book by Elizabeth Shackman-Hurd, Beyond Religious Freedom. She's in international relations at Northwestern. Scholars have observed that when religious freedom is made the focal point of policy, certain unanticipated consequences may follow that run contrary to the goals of religious freedom. Most troublingly, scholars have observed that in the very act of seeking out cases of religious discrimination that demand remedy, an international policy of religious freedom has a certain tendency to single out individuals and groups as religious groups, to portray social conflict as religious or sectarian in origin, and to allow other forms of group affiliation and other causes of social conflict to drop out of sight. So in short, and I'm referencing Hurd's argument here, the politics of religious freedom, which aims to diminish sectarian violence, runs the risk of strengthening sectarian identification and diminishing the very possibility of cross-cutting non-sectarian forms of politics. I will argue that the US religious freedom reports provide an account of cow protectionist politics that threatens to undermine the goal of reducing anti-minority violence and discrimination. They do so, in my view, by unnecessarily portraying cow protection in the stark terms of a conflict between Hindus and Muslims. In so doing, they threaten to undermine, or at least dangerously obscure, emerging forms of cross-cutting non-sectarian alliance. So there's my question for you. Is the account of cow protection provided in the US religious reform reports adequate? For my first question, I'm going to ask, is it adequate to say that anti-slaughter laws violate Muslims' religious freedom? Again, I'm drawing from some of the central points that are highlighted in these US religious freedom reports. So in describing cow protection as a violation of religious freedom, of their mandate, the US reports note that in addition to fostering anti-Muslim discrimination, India's anti-slaughter laws violate Muslims' religious right to practice their religion, that is, their right to sacrifice a cow on the occasion of the Islamic holy day of Eid al-Adha, right? It is true that the British colonial policy of religious neutrality claimed to balance Hindus' religious demand that cattle lives be preserved against Muslims' religious right to cow sacrifice. And it's also true that the first Supreme Court ruling by the Republic of India, by the Indian Supreme Court in 1958, overturned that colonial settlement, and Muslim groups ever since have been seeking to reestablish cow sacrifice as a legal right. But I think the US religious freedom reports are more accurate when they say that many Muslims believe or Muslims complain that sacrifice is essential to their religion. Indian Muslims have in fact long disagreed about whether the sacrifice of a cow rather than another animal, such as a goat, is religiously obligatory. The politics of religious freedom can exert a certain subtle pressure to portray a group's religious teachings as unanimous and clear-cut. But if our objective is to reduce sectarian conflict, then it may not be helpful to reinforce notions of strongly conflicting Muslim and Hindu religious imperatives, right? Muslim imperative to kill cows, a Hindu imperative not to kill cows, right? So long as other possibilities are present. Right? The US reports state that anti-slaughter laws are dictated by the Constitution and by the Supreme Court's ruling in the 1958 Qureshi judgment. One report state, and others might be said to imply, that the Indian government is keen to maintain this legislation based on Hindu religious sentiments. Again, the pressure to describe cow protection in terms of religious freedom has produced some distortions. Neither the Constitution of India nor the Qureshi decision advocated restrictions on cattle slaughter for overtly religious reasons. Both couch the imperative to preserve cattle from slaughter within the imperatives of scientific agriculture. Moreover, the 1958 Qureshi judgment did not prohibit the slaughter of all cattle. It allowed a total ban on the slaughter of female cows, but it set important limits to anti-slaughter laws out of regard to the right of cattle butchers to their occupations, the economic burden on the country of maintaining useless animals under conditions of general food scarcity, and also the nutritional needs of impoverished Indians who relied on the cheapest available source of protein, beef. This is an important correction to our understanding because the contemporary anti-slaughter legislation and the discriminatory actions that have accompanied it are based in a more recent Supreme Court decision in 2005, the Mirzapur decision, which eliminated those restrictions on cattle slaughter that the Qureshi judgment had put in place to prohibit instead the slaughter of all cattle, regardless of age, sex, or usefulness for labor or milk production. Next, we must ask, is it adequate to say that vigilante violence primarily targets Muslims? Okay. The US reports on religious freedom give special attention to Muslims as victims of hate speech and vigilante violence for good reason. From the murderous assault on Mohammed Akhlaq in Dadri, UP in September 2015, to the killing of 16-year-old Junaid Khan on a Delhi-Mathura train in June of 2017, and more multiple incidents sort of between and also since. Both of those incidents allegedly on suspicion of possessing beef, Muslims have been frequent targets of cow vigilante violence. But in highlighting persecution of the Muslim religious minority, the US reports very nearly disregard many other victims of cow protectionist violence and oppression. This near silence would seem to be a consequence of the fact that other opponents of cow protection who experience anti-slaughter initiatives as injustice did not fall easily along the lines of Hindu-non-Hindu religious difference. Cow protectionist vigilantes have also perpetrated grievous violence against Dalits, that is, members of the most depressed classes in India, ostensibly for their role in slaughter-related trades, ostensibly. For example, in Una town in Gujarat in July of 2016, 7 members of a Dalit family were badly beaten for skinning a cow and sort of on suspicion of having slaughtered that cow. This violence reached such a scale that Dalits in Gujarat employed in carcass removal put their lives and their livelihoods at further risk to go on strike in protest, right? So that Una event was only one indication that happened to make it into the national press. In addition to direct physical violence, Dalits also suffer other kinds of harm from cow protection. Strengthened prohibitions on cattle slaughter cause considerable economic hardship to the many Dalits employed in the leather industry. That industry is reported to have been nearly shut down in some locations. It's typically said to be largely dominated by Dalits. The politics of cow protection also does significant harm to those Indians who eat beef. This is no small number. As is often pointed out, the beef industry in India is a large one by any standards. Beef as the common man's diet is significantly the cheapest meat product available in the country. And that's quoting from a scholar, Shraddha Chigateri. So many Dalits include beef in their diet, whether as a matter of food culture and community pride or out of economic necessity. Whatever their reasons, Dalits are regularly derided for this food choice, which upper caste Hindus associate with demeaned social status. Like Indian Muslims, Dalits are also regularly subjected to the jeering and derogatory taunt of being beef eater. So this means that a great number of Hindus in India eat beef, and a great number of Hindus in India are oppressed by the politics of cow protection. Dalits' religious affiliation has been contested since the colonial period, when the question of how to classify Dalits in terms of religious community first became a matter of administrative and political concern. Although religious and cultural separatism remains an important strand in Dalit politics, and many Dalits have rejected Hinduism to convert to Buddhism, most Dalits are officially classed as Hindus in the Republic of India. Other low-caste Hindus, those classified by the Constitution as other backward castes, also eat beef and are ready to assert this food choice as a matter of identity and pride. Moreover, although the dominant upper caste Hindu understanding arranges caste from low to high in a food hierarchy that puts beef at the bottom, Hindus of all castes may include beef in their diet. In the southern state of Kerala, Hindus as well as Muslims and Christians consider beef to be part of Kerala's food culture. Many Indians, Muslim and non-Muslim, are hurt by cow protection. Many are also opposing anti-slaughter laws and violence. And here I want to think about what possibilities we see in India for cross-cutting alliances. Protests against the politics of cow protection have cut across the lines of religious difference. In November, farmers in Rajasthan came out in protest against anti-slaughter laws, which have made it difficult for them to refresh their work animals, for example, in the wake of the killing of young Junaid. Not in My Name protests against mob lynching drew members of all religions of caste and caste to sort of mass protests in cities across India. Protests against anti-beef laws have also drawn protests protests against the anti-beef laws have also drawn protests from wide-ranging religions and castes. Whatever their own food preferences, many Indians oppose both anti-slaughter and anti-beef laws as illegitimate interference with citizens' right to choose their own food. And here I want to give one specific legal example that's pending in the courts. Over the past year, a legal challenge has been filed against the Bombay High Court by a group of 30 Maharashtra social activists, some Dalits and some not, on the grounds that the state's anti-slaughter law violates citizens' dietary rights. The case will be heard by the Supreme Court. The petitioners are represented by senior advocate Indira J. Singh. I understand she was appointed to the UN Fact-Finding Commission for violations in Myanmar. Indira J. Singh observes that the case breaks new legal ground. And this is a quote from her. This is perhaps the first time that consumers of beef have approached the Supreme Court on purely secular grounds. And I think what she means that is not making claims as a religious minority or making claims to a right for freedom of religious worship. All previous petitions in the courts have been on behalf of butchers and their right to carry on a profession, or of Muslims claiming that slaughtering cows is an essential part of their religion. And the end of that quote. If social protests have indicated cross-cutting alliances, this lawsuit, it seems to me, marks the possibility of bringing those alliances into the jurisprudence of cow protection. For Jay Singh is now seeking to challenge not only Maharashtra's state law, which specifically bans beef possession, but also the troubling 2005 Mirzapur decision of the Supreme Court, which opened the way to laws banning the slaughter of all cattle without exceptions for butchers, hide merchants, or those who rely on beef for food. So there's real potential here. Okay, allow me to conclude. I'll just sum up. It is clear that cross-cutting, non-sectarian alliances are forming, which bring together Indians of different castes and religious communities to protest or challenge the politics of cow protection on other grounds, including the secular grounds of food rights. Anti-slaughter legislation and violence targets Muslims and Dalits, and it harms a much wider swath of the Indian population, including Muslims, Buddhists, and Hindus of different castes and communities. The imperative of an international policy of religious freedom must surely be to reinforce such cross-cutting alliances so as to soften the stark boundaries of sectarian identification. The accounts of the Indian politics of cow protection that are currently provided in the reports of the U.S. Department of State's Office of International Religious Freedom and by the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom don't do enough, I think, to capture these possibilities. This may surely be a consequence of the practical business of providing a summary that is clear and workable for policy reasons, but it is necessary to observe that both Hindu nationalists and cow protectionists single out Muslims as the primary opponents of cow protection. In their accounts, this reinforces stereotypes of Muslims as a harmful anti-national presence. When the U.S. Religious Freedom reports similarly place excessive emphasis on a supposed religious conflict between Hindus and Muslims in India around the cow slaughter issue, they run the risk of reinforcing the very sectarian stereotypes and divisions that they seek to undermine. Thank you.
Well, thank you to Professor Adcock. Let's now go to Professor Neil Devota.
Well, thank you, Niti and Michael for inviting me. I am going to be talking about Sinhalese Buddhist nationalism and an organization that has sprung up since the Civil War ended. But let me provide some context as to the paramountcy of Buddhism in the country. It's a country with a history of Buddhism going back about 2,500 years, as per some of the texts that have been put together. The texts themselves are maybe 1,500 years old, but there is no gainsaying that Sri Lanka is a very, very special place for Buddhists, and you encounter that, within a few minutes of being in the island. But what you also encounter is the fact that there are other religions that are thriving in the island. A recent claim released by the Religious Affairs Ministry said that there were 20,000 places of worship in this island that's the size of West Virginia. And 10,000 places are comprised of Buddhist temples, 5,000 Hindu kovyals, 2,500 mosques, and 2,500 churches of all denominations. These are approximate figures, and they were released as part of a proclamation that required permission from the ministry for the construction of new places of worship. And the group that's been targeted, obviously, are the Muslims. They want to make sure that there has been a rise in the number of mosques. And these new mosques are different. They look different from the older mosques. They look green, and they're more kind of, they represent the mosques that you see in the Middle East, as opposed to the white dome mosques that are, more a part of the South Asian designs. And if I have time, I'll say a bit more about the anti-Muslim sentiment that we're seeing in the country since about 2012. Starting around the mid-19th century, we see an uptick in Sinhalese Buddhist nationalism, and that uptick is connected to the ways in which the British colonial authorities broke their promises to protect and support, provide subventions and the like to Buddhist monasteries. Buddhism relies on the laity. Not everybody in a society can be Buddhist. The society ceases to be if everybody becomes a monk. So, and historically, it's depended especially on the king and the court and the state. And when the British administratively unified the island in 1815, got them to sign a convention, they agreed to support the temples, and that did not happen. And as a result of that and proselytization, there was kind of a pushback on the part of monks, and that's when you start to see kind of a rise in nationalism. And by the early 20th century, you have the politicization of this movement, because politicians are starting to now grasp at this kind of thriving nationalism for political expediency. But even at this time, what you have is a country that's pretty tolerant for the most part. But after independence in 47, precisely because the constitution that was written by the British did not have any specific guarantees that protected minorities, you started to see the two main parties outbid each other on who could kind of promote the best deal for the minorities. And the demographics actually lends itself to that, because the Sinhalese are about 75% of the population right now, but the Buddhists are about 70. 100 years ago in 1911, not 100 years ago, but in 1911, that census put the Buddhists at 65% and the Sinhalese at 70%. 100 years later, in 2011, the Buddhist population had gone up by 5%, and the Sinhalese population had gone up by 5%. But that is not something that many other nationalists seem to recognize, because they keep harping about how the Sinhalese on the verge of extinction, like the Eskimos, and that Sinhalese mothers should have 5 and 6 children. So, but this is the demographic rhetoric connected to nationalism is something we see in India and other places as well. So, with the introduction of democracy, party politics, the politicization of Buddhism, you have this movement towards a singhalist Buddhist supremacy, so much so that in 1972, the constitution that was put together actually provided the foremost place for Buddhism. And the 78 constitution inserted that statement more or less verbatim. And they are now debating about instituting a new constitution. I don't think it's gonna end up happening, but the draft is in place, and there are all kinds of commissions that have been put together, and discussions are going on very seriously. And every single prominent politician, singhalist politician, has said that Buddhism will continue to be provided foremost status. Now, this is about religious freedom. Now, I don't want you to leave the room and go tell people there was this guy called Neil Devota who gave a talk and he said there's no religious freedom in Sri Lanka. I mean, that's not true. There's ample religious freedom in Sri Lanka. But what's important is that this religious freedom exists with Buddhism being provided a foremost status. And minorities are free to practice their religions as long as they know their place, okay? And so, and I'll try to connect with this later because I think one very important question that those of us who care about this issue need to grapple with is how we try to promote, as policymakers, as scholars, how we try to promote religious freedom for religious minorities within an atmosphere where you have a dominant religious community that insists on that group being superior. And this is true for all these countries, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh increasingly, certainly Sri Lanka, where you have constitutions, where you have laws codified as part of constitutions that provide privileged status to the dominant community. And that's not gonna change because as you said, in Pakistan, if you've gone from 23% minorities to 3%, it's not like it's gonna go to 7% in the next 10 years, it's gonna get even lower, okay? So this is a question that one has to grapple with because one of the kind of some of the rhetoric that we see coming out of countries like the US that cares a lot about religious freedom and promotes secularism can sometimes lead to problems, and this is connected to your paper as well, because secularism is a dirty word in these societies. Because secularism is seen as a Western construct that is being used to undermine the status of these religious communities, a status that they have actually acquired after quite a bit of pushback and fighting, given that these are also colonial societies. In Sri Lanka, there's an interesting dynamic in place, and that is because, on the one hand, the Buddhists are a clear majority, but they're a clear majority that have a superior complex because they're a majority in terms of demographics, but who at the same time suffer from a minority complex given their minority status in the region. So, you look across the Pork Straits and there are 75 million Tamils who are Hindus in Tamil Nadu, okay? As one Buddhist monk told me some years back, I mean, if these guys peed in unison, we'd have a flood, I mean, he actually used, he used a very crass singular language, and I said they're just across the border. We Sinhalese only have Sri Lanka. There are millions of Muslims in the subcontinent and in the Middle East, okay? There are millions of Hindus across the Pork Straits, 75 million Tamils in Tamil Nadu, and they all want to come here. And so, and connected with this is that these other groups have a kind of a religious civilization that they can look to elsewhere. So the Catholics have Rome, and the Muslims have Mecca and Medina, and the Hindus have India, and the Sinhalese Buddhists only have Sri Lanka. And connected to this also is kind of a narrative about how Buddhism has withered in Asia. So they will talk about Afghanistan once being a area that thrived with all these locations, with Buddhism, and doesn't exist anymore. And so it's a well-grounded narrative, and it's a very persuasive narrative. And when these monks actually get on the stage and they talk about how unique the religion is, and it's connected to a mytho-history, which I'll get to very quickly, it's very, very powerful. So you have this minority complex that is interacting with kind of a superior majority complex. And it's similar to India. So the RSS types talk about Pitri Bhumi, which India is the fatherland, and Punya Bhumi, where India is the holy land. And the argument there is similar, that Muslims and Christians can always consider India their fatherland, but it's never going to be their holy land, because they're always going to look to Mecca or to Rome or to Jerusalem or wherever. Now, this in turn is connected to a mytho-historical narrative where the Sinhalese Buddhist, and I'm not going to go into the text and the story, but the Sinhalese Buddhists actually see Sri Lanka, and this is mentioned in a text that goes back over 1,500 years, where Sri Lanka is designated by the Buddha as Sinhadvipa, meaning island of the Sinhalese, and Dhammadvipa, meaning the island where Buddha's religion was supposed to be reposed. And the Sinhalese then are the ones who are supposed to protect it, nurture it, and spread it. Which in turn is connected to a nationalist ideology that basically says that this island that is the island of the Sinhalese and the designated sanctuary of Buddhism, with the Buddhists chosen to protect and propagate Buddha's teachings, and while there are other religions that live on the island, thanks to the goodwill of the Buddhists, okay, they should make sure to appreciate that goodwill and not make undue demands, okay? And those who try to make such demands are traitors. And the list of supposed traitors inevitably includes the minorities, but during the years when the war was conducted, and under the Rajapaksa government, the previous government, this list of traitors expanded to non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations, journalists, media who speak out on minorities' rights. Whenever foreign governments criticize policies or activities that threatened or marginalized religious minorities, this ideology kind of, basically talked about how, or the ideology was used to rhetorically talk about how these countries are trying to undermine Buddhism. They are jealous of Sri Lanka, and we have to be careful about dealing with them and the like. And if you look at what this does, the way in which this ideology is used to justify certain policies that counter democracy, that contribute to democratic regression, these are some of the same tactics that are used in authoritarian countries. And so the point I want to make is that this Sinhalese Buddhist nationalist ideology is actually something that can work within an authoritarian setting. And Rajapaksa, the previous government, led by Mahinda Rajapaksa, was very good at connecting the two, because he projected himself as the ultimate Sinhalese Buddhist kind of hero, and the one who was responsible for eradicating the LTT militarily, and who would always stand up for Sinhalese Buddhist rights. But in the process, he also moved towards instituting an authoritarian system. And had he not lost the election in January 2015, I mean, Sri Lanka, I think right now would be classified by, all the Bertelsmann Stiftung and all the others that rank these countries as more or less an authoritarian state. Now, after the end of the Civil War, which happened in May 2009, a civil war that lasted almost 30 years, that led to at least 100,000 people being killed, the expectation was that, the Tamils and the other minorities would be better accommodated, because the biggest threat was eliminated. This was the LTT. What happened instead was that the victory ended up emboldening the Sinhalese Buddhist nationalists. And within a couple of years, 2.5 years or so, they started going after, there was a new group that was created called the BBS, the Bodhu Bala Sena, which means Buddhist Power Force, together with some other groups, and they started to go after the Muslims. Now, this was really, really tragic. And I mean, I have talked to so many Muslims, I've done so many interviews, and it was very, very painful because the Muslims always considered themselves to have been loyal to the Sri Lankan state. They opposed the Tamil quest towards secession, even though they spoke the same language. Many of them were killed in their mosques. About over 60,000 Muslims were evicted with just 24 hours notice from the northern province by the LTT. Some of them still continue to live as refugees. Muslims, because they spoke the Tamil language and came from areas, some of them came from areas that were close to where the LTT was located, spied for the military and provided it with intelligence. And suddenly, within 2 to 3 years, they are now being targeted with the most vile rhetoric. Now, what you see here is politics combining with economics and culture to create a narrative about how Muslims are the new threat to Sinhalese Buddhist society. Because the Tamils were fully marginalized, kept down, and it was easy for the government, especially Rajapaksa, who actually did the calculations and believed that he didn't need the minorities' support to keep winning in the future. Now that backfired on him. So the politics then was based on not needing minority support and therefore being able to marginalize the minorities, especially the Muslims in this instance. The economic angle plays into this because there's long been accusations against the Muslim community. Some of it may be true, but this is not some master narrative that's true, in its totality. For instance, I have been swindled by Tamil businessmen. I have been swindled by Sinhalese businessmen, and I have been swindled by Muslim businessmen. It's the way South Asia works. If you've been to a bazaar, you pay 4 times more for something and find out that you could have bought the same thing for 25%, of what you paid somewhere else. And so, but the narrative is that Muslims tend to, well, the stereotypes, they tend to trade with each other very fairly, but when they start trading with non-Muslims, then they start to fleece you. They insist on non-Muslims converting to Islam, and there's some truth to that. They are all into business. Now, they're all into business. Most of them are into business because it's not like the state is offering them jobs. Muslims who want to join the military are not taken into the military. Muslims who want to join the bureaucracy are not taken into the bureaucracy. So they've got to survive, and they came into the country to do business in any case, and they've kind of maintained that neck. And so you have competitors, Sinhalese competitors, who would like to see, certain Muslim businessmen dealing with certain, trading activities eliminated or weakened. And this happened with the Tamils in '83. That was the biggest reason for the riot in '83. Not the biggest, but a big reason for the riot. So you have politics, economics, and culture, this sense that Muslims are transforming the culture. And here they start referring to women wearing the burqa. And there is at least from what one sees, an increase in the kind of piety within the Muslim community. I mean, I grew up in a Muslim neighborhood for a number of years in a very congested part of Colombo. And I may have seen 2 women wearing a burqa. And today you see women, many, many women. In fact, right in front of my grandma's house is a store that specializes in selling burqas. Okay, and so, but you see this in many parts of South Asia as well. And so this rattles the Sinhalese Buddhist nationalists because they're able to point to all of this and say, look, our culture is changing right before our eyes, and these Muslims are the biggest threat. And then, of course, you're bringing the ISIS and you feed into the Islamophobia that is trending globally, and it's just very, very powerful, you know. Now, post-war, there are two communities that have been especially targeted. One is the Christian evangelical community, and I didn't say too much about that in my paper because most of the attacks that have taken place since 2012, since 2012 September, there have been 650 attacks against Muslims. Many mosques, schools, some very prominent mosques, shops, and businesses. There have been a number of attacks against evangelicals as well, which doesn't actually get too much press. In fact, if you want to read about attacks against evangelicals in Sri Lanka, you should actually, the American sites, evangelical groups in the US do a better job documenting those attacks than you'd see the Sri Lankan press do. But some of the complaints that you hear from evangelical pastors is that people who have converted, especially in villages, because they've converted from Buddhism to, say, Jehovah's Witnesses, Assembly of God, they are harassed, they cannot get jobs, buses don't stop for them, three-wheeler auto rickshaws don't stop for them. Sometimes the kind of, doctors, when they go to a public hospital, will take a long, long time to see them. Neighbors are discouraged from renting to such people. So some of them have to live quite a ways from where they work. Those are the kind of complaints. If homes that have prayer meetings get stoned, this kind of thing. And you actually read about it on these evangelical sites that are maintained by US evangelical groups. The Muslims have come out they've basically experienced the most attacks. Interestingly, there have been very few Muslims killed in some of these very drastic attacks. And so what they've targeted really are property. So there's looting and there's property being destroyed. And so there's a certain amount of envy that is part and parcel of the kind of violence we're seeing. I can say more about this. I can say more about this during question and answer time. But I'll end with a couple of thoughts. And one I mentioned, this whole issue of how do, organizations in the West, governments in the West that are very interested in ensuring religious freedom, how do you promote that in these sorts of societies without making things worse for religious minorities? I don't have an answer. But I think, given that we're dealing with societies that all have majority communities that are post-colonial and that, have majoritarianism more or less in place, that I think is an important question. The other thing is whether, it is possible to think about separating religious freedom from secularism, because we lump the two together often. We can't expect establishment clause type secularism in South Asia, number one. But even if you thought in terms of secularism being equal respect or regard for all religion, that's not happening either. So what do we need to kind of separate these two notions as we try to do good? And I'll stop there.
Well, thank you. That was really very fascinating. Well, Professor Ali Riaz, you have the unenviable responsibility of providing the 8th of the 8 presentations today.
Okay. Is it a reminder that everyone is exhausted
final
by
presentation.
now? Thanks, Michael, for the reminder, and thank you for having me. Thanks to Niti and, of course, Bijan for this excellent event. I'll try to be very brief, of course, hoping there will be some time left for Q&A. My job, to a certain extent, has become easier after Dina Siddiqui's presentation, but I will try to build on that and maybe go a little bit off from there, too. If you are reading regularly Guardian, New York Times, Washington Post, and few other newspapers on a regular basis and try to understand Bangladesh over the past 4 years, beginning 2013, you may get an impression that Bangladesh has become the latest battleground between Islam and secularism. That is the picture that I get. If I'm misreading it, please do correct me. But I do read newspapers quite regularly and try to, in many instances, do pay for them too. So, nevertheless, this is the impression that is being provided. And of course, the understanding is this. Since 2013, the bloggers have been killed. Of course, there are attacks on quote-unquote secular liberal thinkers, within quotation. Of course, there have been this rise of the militant groups connected to transnational groups such as AQIS and ISIS. Of course, this spectacular and very horrific attack on 1st of July, 2016. All these things are the backdrop within which we have been hearing this kind of things. But there are supposition that we see that as if there is an ideal secularism somewhere, and as if Bangladesh was at one point a secular state, somehow it started walking down that stair, God knows when, as if there is a defined Islam somewhere that you are going to fight back, or it is fighting back. These are the presuppositions, but nobody talks about those, assumes that these are given, these are the ones. In this instance, I have limited myself to do two simple things. I think by the end of the day, it might be redundant to some of you, but this is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to address this binarization, this whole thing, the way it has been put in Bangladesh, that as if it's a battle between secularism and Islam. I'm trying to question that one. I'm not yet convinced. If there are people who can convince me, I'm open to that. The second thing is to look at the lived Islam, and I use the term lived Islam broadly in the sense that how it is done, how people actually live a religion and in the society. But any conversation with respect to Bangladesh, and particularly on these secularism-Islam issues, there is a dominant narrative. And you can hear it, I can see it, it has been reproduced days in, days out. What are the things? There are two elements to it. Number one, which of course Dina has highlighted in her conversation, the problematic part of it, is the secularism is the inherent spirit of the Bengalis. And of course, which has spearheaded the 1971, hence Bangladesh in 1971, 16 December, which emerged, has to be a secular state. It has definitely a secular state. There's no doubt about it, because as if the Bengali, the term, it is conflated as a religious, a hyphenated religious identity. As if you are Bengali, you cannot be Muslim. You cannot, there's somehow this notion has been, the notion of this construction of nation through the whole entire period, let's say 47, even before, the imagination of nation as it is projected through this dominant narrative is largely trying to tell us that somewhere there is a separation. Where exactly, when it happened, we never know. We're never told. At least I was never told when exactly at one point there's separation, because the history tells me differently, and I'm going to talk about that. The second element, and there is a continuous narrative to it, that the Bengalis are, of course, secular. The movement was secular, hence it is a secular state. And then something happened. What happened? The Bangladesh state started to go down the road of not being the secular. There is a juridico-legal things, the constitutional provisions, 1975, then of course the changes in the constitution of replacing the secularism in 1978, 79, and then comes this 1988, the Islam is the state religion. Of course, things have changed since 2011. 15th Amendment has brought everything pretty much back to the place where it should be. We have a little bit of problem. We are going to solve it soon. This is the narrative. This is the juridico-legal narrative. And then, if you are talking to the Islamists, so to speak, their contestation, they're not questioning this narrative as such. what they are doing, they're saying that there is a resurgence of Islam. Why? Because of this backlash of this secularist policy. I don't see the secularism, but they see the secularism and they see the backlash. First of all, this is a very selective history. If we go back and, in Bengal, which is now Bangladesh, this part of the Bengal, had two very significant movements in the 19th century. One is the Faraizi movement, and another is the Tariqa-e-Muhammadiyya. And Tariqa-e-Muhammadiyya was closely connected to what we can describe as the global interpretation, because they did believe in jihad, they did send people to fight outside Bengal. This is the history that we're talking. But then again, you don't have to go back to that history if you don't want to. In the 19th and 20th century, if you look at Bengal, what we witness, and if we look very closely, that there are various kind of societies, anjums, which were created in the literary and social arena, which have talked about the identity issue, the question of religion, the question of language, so to speak, and how they situate those conversations. Take, for example, one in 1926, Muslim Sahitya Samaj, which had its own mouthpiece called Shikha, which has talked about, and their argument was that there is a rationalist Muslim identity rooted in the Bengali cultural tradition. So these are inseparable. You don't simply say these are separable. You take this part or that part. There is no either or. There is no binary that it is. But has that changed after 1947? Has 47 changed it? Some of those would argue that, given that the Bangladesh, or the part that became Bangladesh, became part of Pakistan, they chose it. Sylhet did vote for that one, of course, and hence the argument is that there was a pendulum-like swing towards the system, and they have embraced, as if this embracing Pakistan as an idea of nation, completely obliterated the other imaginations of nation. There are various kinds of imagination of nations at that time, even 1940s. The notion of the United Bengal is one kind of imagination of nation. There was another kind of imagination is, if we agree to it, which I don't, that there's two-nation theory. Even if you accept that terminology, there's one imagination. There could be other imagination, which couldn't become dominant, couldn't become hegemonic, does not necessarily mean that it didn't exist. So there were various kinds of. So 1947, by definition, does not tell us that someone has embraced one identity vis-a-vis the other. One imagination of nation at that point in Bengal became hegemonic, and that is what we saw by having, and there are other interpretations. Why it became hegemonic does not necessarily mean because of the religious part of it. There are economic part to it. There are other elements to it, which has been clearly demonstrated. They have been documented in various studies. Hence, to say that by being part of Pakistan in 1947, they suddenly became Muslim as if they were not before, or post-1947, by this language movement, in this dominant narrative, in some ways the rupture or the critical point is 1952, the language movement, as if the language movement itself is a negation of this religious identity, so to speak. I don't think so. I mean, Ahmad Kamal's fascinating work called State Against the Nation clearly showed that even in 1950s, it drew many of the metaphors and concepts from the idioms and institution of Islam. So which being described in the dominant narrative as a quote-unquote secularist movement drew metaphors from the religion, because it is natural, it is not unusual. In the 1950s, when they are growing appeal of Bengali identity, or as Bengali identity, the ethnic identity became hegemonic, does not necessarily mean that it is completely disavowal of the religious element to it. And then so what happened in the 1960s? Because in this dominant narrative, again, the point is in 1960 everything changed because we saw the secular movement. In 1950s and 1960s, Pakistani state politicized Islam. Islam became the the reason. If you look at the rhetoric, the Pakistan is there, why Pakistan supports Pakistan defense, and in other presentations it came out very clearly that as if the Islam and Pakistan became entangled into one. And that is what happened in 1950s, late 1950s, early 1960s, and that is what is being rejected. The political Islam is being rejected as the basis of state by the Bangladeshi or the Bengali ethnic community. And what I see at that point is this, of course, 1960s also saw the rise of the middle class in Bangladesh. So this middle class is finding difficult to embrace what is a very eclectic local cultural roots, which is Islam, which is very much religious, and religious does not necessarily mean that they see that as a political ideology. In their daily lives, in their practices, in various parts, various rural traditions that we have seen, and that remain. But the middle class has emerged. They cannot identify with this very much rural, eclectic Islam. They have to find out something. And what is that something? They were talking about personal religiosity, public display of faith, and adherence to religious culture and social life, somewhat separate from this politics, because they want to oppose Pakistan. Pakistani state is being opposed because it goes against the very fundamental economic interest of the rising middle class. They want to have a pie, a share of the pie, and they want to be part of the state, which Pakistani state is not giving them. So for their economic interest, they are fighting, and here they are trying to create a distinction of themselves from the Pakistani state on top, because that is not the Islam they want. And they also do not want to be associated with this rural eclectic Islam because they're educated. They are not rural people, After all, they have become middle class. So that is what we saw, which is being seen as or described as the secular one. But now, so the identity question, the way it is phrased, I see problematic there. I mean, this is highly problematic in this grand narrative that they are trying to push. The second element, the juridico-legal one, that 1972, the constitution was framed, secularism was written, 1975 military coup d'etat happened, and since then we are going down the road. Of course, there are changes in the constitution. Of course, it has an implication, but it is not entirely, top-bottom kind of situation, because even when 1972 secularism was inserted into the constitution, and again, going back to Dina has reminded us that it took only 3 weeks to write the whole constitution. No conversation, absolutely no conversation, not only about ethnicity, not only about anything else. I mean, the draft constitution didn't have the provision for the emergency, which they had to attach to it, later with an amendment. Now, what does that mean? That means that there is a tension, that latent tension always there. The meaning of secularism was not clear. What exactly does that mean? Personally, I have an enormous problem with the translation itself, because it says dharma nirupekkhata. Secularism is translated, if you then retranslate it into English, it doesn't actually become secularism. Neutrality about religion, something like that. Who is neutral? State is neutral about the religion, or religion is neutral about the state? So that remains a very contentious one. And this whole grand narrative that was created at that point, and since being reproduced, particularly in recent years, that it is a very elite constructed, narrative, which is not telling us that there are tensions. And these existing tensions, the root of all this is the absence of the secularization. A secular state, quote unquote, a secular state, as envisioned in the constitution, was practically parachuted into Bangladesh. And that's nothing unusual in case of Bangladesh. All post-colonial states have done it. Practically, that's what happened. So there is no effort of secularizing the whole society. State-sponsored secularism, The state often fails to reduce the overall influence of religion because of the absence of this entire secularization process. As a statecraft, they are talking about secularism, but secularism is not only about statecraft. There are other dimensions to it. And those other dimensions, with respect to the role of the religion in society, in the public sphere, how do you interact with them, what kind of space do you actually allow? Are you going to be like the French state, which does not allow anything, absolutely nothing, or something else? Whether there was any conversation, no. There was no conversation with respect to secularism, insertion of secularism, or deletion of it. When the military dictator decided that it would be deleted, one fine morning they decided to delete it. There's no conversation. And then again, when it was reinserted, no conversation whatsoever. They've decided to insert it. So this entire question is now based on these two narratives. One is this juridical legal narrative, constitution changed, as if you change the constitution through 15, 16, 17, God knows how many constitutional amendments you can do, that secularism is going to come back. It is like divine thing is going to land on your book. It doesn't. Without the process of secularism, without having that conversation, without having that debate, without engaging into that debate, you simply cannot think of it. Now, on the other hand, when those who are the Islamists speak of Islam as if, okay, it is the backlash to the secularist one, what Islam are we talking about? Never talked about the lived experience of the Islam, because Islam, there is no single Islam that you can say that this is Islam, this is that. Yes, there are fundamental, true, universal notion of Islam, as I said, limited only to the fundamental articles of faith. Beyond that, it is basically a negotiation with the state, with the time, all sorts of things. So this notion of the Islamist, that there is one single Islam somewhere out there, and that is what you are going to emulate, seems to be very problematic. And this problematic things has been inserted into the conversation in Bangladesh. Those who are opposed to this argument of secularism, they come up with this another completely homogenizing idea, as if there is only one Islam that goes into. So I call that you'll have to look into the lived Islam rather than simply looking at the fundamental articles of faith. Of course, fundamental articles of faith under the Indonesian or Pakistani or Bangladeshi doesn't differ. But what differ is largely the practice, the lived Islam. How do you live? How do you actually articulate those things, And that is, I divide them as the social Islam and political Islam. I know this is again very problematic one. I couldn't find a better expression of this. The point is that there are, for the social Islam, the way I see it, these are the daily practices, and those are accommodated within the society as we speak in various ways. And to give an idea as to how we can look at Islam being practiced as a lived within the social realm, there are various things. Do we exclude Baul tradition, which is as from the lived Islam? No, we cannot actually exclude it. Or, on the other hand, if you look at this various schools of thought, such as the Ahmadi Muslim community, or for that matter, the Ahl Sunnah element, all these things, can you exclude? No, those are the lived Islam. Those are the ones that practice every day, So there are variations of this, which tends to be completely obliterated, not only in the Islamist discourse, because the Islamists would love to have that kind of discourse, that there is one single Islam, that the interpretation is provided by them. But I see that even in the media, in the current production and reproduction of the situation in Bangladesh, as if that this is how you can define the whole thing. And again, similarly, within the political Islam, what we see is that there is no one single, Political Islam does not mean that all Islamists are the same. There are variations, and you can say some participate in the mainstream politics, some do not participate, and so on. And there are radical elements. So my central argument is this problematizing this very notion. One is this grand narrative that I have heard, and I don't see, the validity of it, because there are so many holes inside this grand narrative with respect to the notion of secularism. So when we are talking about religious freedom, when we are talking about religious tolerance, and based in some ways base those things on the understanding of this notion of a very homogenized, very fixed idea of secularism becomes problematic to me. In similar fashion, the notion that as if there is one single identity that you can adhere to, either you will have to be a Muslim or Bengali, as if this contestation and accommodation didn't take place. It has been taking place for centuries. How come suddenly you are trying to put it as if one against the other, and particularly with respect to the media coverage, and quite simply, I'm not discouraging you to read Guardian or New York Times. I do read them, but do please keep in mind that there are some questions here. Thank you.
Excellent.
Well, thank you, Professor Ali Riaz. And the Guardian does not have a paywall. The New York Times does, so it's a bit easier to read the Guardian. Another really wonderful, rich, and enlightening presentation. Thank you to the four of you. A number of thoughts and questions are in my head, but I'm going to suppress the urge to pose them because I want to make sure that the audience has a chance to pose a question before we conclude. So why don't we go ahead and start? Show of hands for those that would like to pose a question. Okay. Sabir, did you have your hand up? Actually, let's see if there's anyone. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much for all the morning and afternoon session presentations. So just a question comes to mind. We've heard a lot about religious freedom today, and I just wondered if any of the presenters and panelists gave any thought to the intersection of religious freedom and gender equality. I know that there was a lot of discussion around the rights of minorities, but human rights and women's rights and how they get affected by religious freedoms, particularly the way they are enshrined in the Constitution and in the law. And if any of you have any thoughts on that. Thank you.
Why don't we take another question? We'll get to that's a good question. We'll get to that. We'll take a question from you, sir.
Thank you. Ismail Royer from the Religious Freedom Institute. So I was really interested in your comments about sort of the way in which analysis of conflicts and stuff can be misconstrued by focusing on it solely through a lens of religious persecution. So I was wondering, what do you propose as the solution to that? I mean, would you say that the whole apparatus that has been set up since the International Religious Freedom Act should be scrapped or should be supplemented, or what would you suggest?
Yeah. I mean, shall I go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I certainly don't sort of propose that religious freedom should be scrapped as a policy measure or as an ideal, certainly. I think there's still, the ideal is very, it's a very rich ideal. I think many of us uphold to sort of the concerns for minorities that are embedded in upholding that ideal. I think many of us can share that concern. That those who are, sort of characterized or described as being persecuted religious minorities should be protected from persecution. So I share that concern. No, I guess my concern, my task here was to sort of issue a kind of warning or caution about what a religious freedom lens can cause to drop out of sight. And I think that may be particularly at risk when we're talking about international religious freedom and sort of local religious freedom, local controversies, local politics being sort of translated into the language of religious freedom for an international audience, and how much can be lost in that translation. So, I guess I'm sort of going, this is something I've been talking about for some time in my own work. So, in the case of cow protection, I think Muslims, in fact, are suffering particularly much under the current regime. Cow protection is part of that. Anti-slaughter laws are part of that. I don't think it's sort of, their problems are limited to those laws. So sort of being aware of those religious minority issues is not a problem. I guess what I would advise is just to keep, to keep one's awareness open to wider kinds of affiliations and concerns. So those who are negatively affected by the things that look like religious persecution to us, right? Well, maybe all those who are negatively affected by those don't actually fall into a kind of religion category. And then just not to put it aside because it doesn't fit into the story, but rather to see how we can open it up and bring it in. So my concern is just to be aware of cross-cutting kinds of alliances that are possible there. That's my thought. Yeah.
Do any of you want to address the gender equality question? Oh, did you want to? Okay, yeah. Go ahead.
There's a bit of a problem with, I mean, obviously, I respect your approach, but do you not subscribe to the UN Declaration of Human Rights? No, it's a very serious question.
I think I've made it quite clear that I'm not criticizing religious freedom as an ideal.
I'm asking you a straight question. Do you or do you not subscribe to that? Do you not?
I don't not, no. I do not subscribe.
Because
I mean, I think there's always room for being aware of some of the kinds of problems that can follow from policies that seek to implement those kinds of ideals on the ground. And that's what I'm talking about. So I'm not proposing, this is not a blanket criticism of religious freedom as an ideal, nor a blanket criticism of religious freedom in international law. I'm simply trying to point to how stressing specifically minorities that are sort of oppressed minorities, stressing their religious identifications, can actually cause us to sort of lose sight of other kinds of persons who are also similarly affected by those policies that we're trying to change.
Okay,
that's my argument.
I just have one little addition. The major issue on the ground in India with the Dalits is because a lot of the Dalits are converting to Christianity and Islam. And this is something that the RSS and the Modi government doesn't like. So it actually does come down to religion. So that's why when you talk about the Dalits, like this big ethnic group that is disembodied from religion, actually that all comes down to the religious freedom issues that my colleague and I here were talking about. So I do not think, I think if you either subscribe to the UN and you have to subscribe to it, okay, fine. USERF is not perfect. None of these are perfect. But a lot of the time, like Neil was talking about, that you have to look at American evangelical sites to get research. The amount of information gathering, etc., groups like USERF do, should be commended, I think. But maybe that's just me. It's very easy to criticize and sit in a sort of atmosphere, but these people do really save lives.
That's interesting conversation. Maybe you can continue offline afterward. It's a fair point. There was a question all the way in the back. Yes.
Okay. Question has not been brought up. I'll bring it up. I know that they used to have colonial era, British Empire type anti-gay laws in India that were abolished in 2009, but yet reinstated in 2013 that make it a crime to in homosexual relationship there. I'm trying to find out if those laws were reinstated at the behest of Hindu nationalists like, forgive me if I mispronounce, Narendra Modi, I think his name. Are the Hindu nationalists and Modi in favor of those laws, or are they against those laws?
Anyone want to address this question?
I can take a stab at it. My understanding is that they culturally, the rhetoric that you kind of tend to read suggests that these are problems, these are Western issues and Western problems that do not impact Indian women and Indian men, which is absolutely rubbish, because there are enough texts that go back hundreds of years that talk about a lot of freedoms that people enjoyed, within the sexes and between sexes. But my sense is that yes, the RSS and its ilk is not in favor of sexual freedoms that were decriminalized and then I think recriminalized more recently. If I could address your question, because you complained earlier that your previous question was not answered either. So, yes, I'm in a very Christ-like mood, so, yeah. I mean, if you're thinking about the right to worship as a human right, that does not preclude gender. So, if you're advocating for people's right to worship as they see fit, then that pertains to men and women. But what we have to remember is that all these religions are very patriarchal.
Yeah.
And insofar as there are limitations imposed on women, those limitations are imposed by the religions themselves, or the way the religions are interpreted and practiced, not so much by some notion of freedom of religion.
The question was in terms of policy and law, when there is an issue of religious freedom on one hand and women's rights on the other, does the law discriminate against women's rights, or how does this work, both for whether it's minority or the majority? How is it?
I'm not. Are you asking if an advocacy of religious freedom negatively impacts gender rights? No, I don't see the connection there.
Are you?
No, I mean,
Michael still need to be quiet, so I won't reply.
okay.
It's something, it's a big
Did I?
That's right. That how does religious freedom impact on women's rights? Does it discriminate? And what takes precedence?
Right. I mean, possibly, the FGM debate could be helpful in understanding this. Let's take a specific case, and then it might be easier. Because often the argument is that this is a religious practice, which is not, which is basically a cultural practice.
Dina Siddiqui, why don't you?
Did you finish?
No, I haven't finished.
FGM.
Go ahead.
So to me, I mean, this is my perspective. And what happens in the constitutional and legal realm, when it comes to the religious freedom and the gender issue, most of the time that you'd see that given what Neil was trying to, the patriarchal notion of this religious freedom, occasionally, if not always, in many instances would actually give up this gender dimension because of this notion. And that's why I brought this FGM issue, because that is what is being debated and seen as, okay, if it is a religious freedom, they should be allowed to do it. But it's not a religious issue, first of all. It is. So in most of the cases, it is the religious freedom tends to, in the name of the religious freedom, tend to actually obliterate the gender dimension. It happens. Dina may have a different.
Go ahead.
If you don't mind, I have to come back to the question of Dalits and religious freedom, and I'm sorry, and conversion. Just to say that I think the thinking about Dalits, the problem of Dalits in India being primarily one of conversion, and entirely one of conversion, and therefore a problem of religious freedom, is actually one of the ways in which I think, it sort of illustrates one of the ways in which religious freedom can obscure other kinds of concerns that sort of underlie even the sort of the drive behind conversion. So looking at the sort of the drive for caste equality and sort of caste dignity, which is often behind some of the push for conversion. So thinking about those kinds of controversies simply in terms of an international politics of religious freedom or freedom of conversion that we need to advocate can sometimes have the effect of, and again, I'm not criticizing all sort of religious freedom advocacy here, but rather that it can have the sort of the side effect of obscuring from sight equally valid and sort of important politics that those participants are actually more concerned with, right? So, and this is not a criticism of USURF or certainly of IRF, who are doing independent research on the ground in India and trying to remain up to date about what's happening there. But just sort of a general observation about what religious freedom policy can do. So, thank you.
Dina wanted to give a response to this.
She's on the list.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I actually want to follow up. with Cassie's thing is the other thing is that it also generates this idea of conversion, or this fear of conversion to Islam or Christianity is something that exactly the RSS is producing right now. So there's this whole thing on love jihad, that Hindus and Muslims can't get married because of the fear. There's a whole panic. It is, if we reduce the Dalit problem, which I hadn't really heard about, but certainly the Muslim problem in India to this mass conversion of Dalits to Islam, then I think we're also feeding into a very, very destructive narrative that does disservice to the very complex problems that face Dalits in their diversity, as well as Muslims who are also not one unitary community. Not also in Tamil, in Sri Lanka, I will say, I was gonna, my point was about something else, but I do think in Sri Lanka, the people in Eastern Tamil, Eastern Sri Lanka are very different from the Ismailis and the communities in the merchant communities that were, and their problems are maybe slightly different. I want to really answer in a very short way without getting into a huge debate about the gender and religious freedom thing, and I think one could talk about this all day and not agree, but to come to the question by assuming there is a always already set opposition between gender equality or women's rights and religion of freedom assumes already that whatever you think of as religion is always already oppressive to women. Right? This is not to say religions can't be patriarchal, which of course they are, but the way in which, for instance, I was talking in the morning, one of the people I referred to in the morning on the idea of secularism was somebody named Mayanti Fernanda, who's written a very interesting book on the French Republic and its idea of secularism, okay? In which, if there are young or even old French people, Muslim French, who want to put on the hijab or whatever else, their freedom of religion or freedom of choice, I would say, is taken away by the secular French state in the name of secular rights. I think, there can't be a general answer to your question, but I do think the question, it needs to be unpacked. We can't assume that religion is always already the problem.
Yeah,
Raza, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to a bit. I think one of the what Neil mentioned in his paper about the economic compulsions, I think there's an elephant in the room, which is the rise of neoliberalism in the last 2-3 decades especially. I mean, if we see the case of India, where Mr. Modi promises a better economic future, has a Gujarat success story to tell, and the Indian middle classes are following that, and that comes as a package of wrapped in religious Puritan identity, and there's this whole invocation of the pure. So cow slaughter politics is just a segment of that larger mosaic of purity, in which you have this Christian and the Muslim other, you have the Dalit deviant DD, and then you have the Prime Minister, who also heads the largest party ruling, saying that that ancient India had invented cosmetic surgery because Lord Ganesha has the face of an elephant, and then that Mahabharata had television and spaceships in it, which may be true even when you believe in those things, when the state says that. And that is the worrying part, that this whole thing as a Pakistani reminds me of the 1980s Islamization movement under Ziaul Haq, when the state, when we had Islamic science conferences where we debated how can we produce energy from jinns, or how, to solve the load shedding problem. And the underpinnings of it all happening to a great degree in Pakistan, also to some degree in Bangladesh and India is the whole neoliberal push, which also needs to be understood in this larger debate. So I guess it's beyond religious freedom in that sense. I think it's more kind of complicated what's happening.
To say the least. We're going to have to start wrapping up soon. Are there any other questions? Tom, did you have your hand up before? You're going to drop it?
He gave up.
Well, Let me just say that I think this has been a terrific day. It's been a fascinating day, and I think that what we did here was something that I like to think the Wilson Center does all the time and likes to do, and that's to take a salient policy issue like religious freedom and subject it to deeper analysis, drawing on the expertise of the types of folks we had here today from the academic world and the policy world. And I think that I'd like to think that many of us learned something, and clearly we could go on, but we're going to need to wrap up. I just wanted to thank once again all of our speakers, as well as Niti Nair, who deserves a tremendous amount of credit, as well as Bijan. A reminder that the presentations you heard will be published in a forthcoming special issue of Asian Affairs. So with that, thank you very much all for coming, and we're now adjourned.